Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Miss van Westhausen. Now, you have a witness for us, I believe.
I do, my lord. It's Mr. Frew, who's the Chief Executive Officer of YouthLink Scotland.
Good morning, Mr. Frew.
Good morning.
I'm sure Miss van der Westerhuizen will have some questions for you, so I'll ask her to start now. Thank you.
Thank you, my lord. Mr. Frew, please could you confirm your full names?
So my name is Timothy Frew.
And you gave a witness statement to the inquiry, and my lord, for reference, that statement can be found using reference number WT0267. So, Mr. Frew, you are the Chief Executive Officer of YouthLink Scotland, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And you've been in that role since 2018?
Yes.
Would you outline perhaps your background prior to taking on that role, please?
So I'd actually been working at YouthLink Scotland before that in a number of different roles, and I've had experience across the youth work sector before that, working in local authorities and in voluntary organisations.
Thank you. Please could you outline briefly what your role as Chief Executive Officer entails, just in general terms, but also specifically in relation to the time during the pandemic?
So so my role is the sort of day-to-day operations and management of YouthLink Scotland, which is the national agency for youth work. I have a role in supporting the organisation, but also representing the sector more broadly in terms of the YouthLink Scotland's role, connecting to voluntary youth work organisations and local authorities who are delivering youth work across Scotland.
Thank you. And could you please provide an overview of YouthLink Scotland, what its aims are, what it does, and the makeup of its membership, please?
Certainly. So YouthLink Scotland, as I said, is the national agency for youth work. We're an independent company and charity, but we're recognised as a key intermediary and the collective voice of the sector. So there are about maybe 50 or 60 national voluntary youth work organisations like the Prince's Trust and uniformed youth organisations, and local authorities that deliver services, youth work services across Scotland, as well as regional and other partners. And each of those are part of the membership of YouthLink Scotland, and we represent their interests. We do things like workforce development, we do innovation, we provide funding or seek funding for the sector. We do research and policy work, communications, workforce support, those kinds of things.
Thank you. And then could you please explain what youth work is, and in particular how it relates or supports education?
So yes, youth work is informal education practice with children and young people. It's about supporting their personal, social and educational development. Very much comes from a rights-based approach to children and young people, supporting the broader general education of young people, and also thinking about their voice and their participation in society. So we have an outcome and skills framework as a sector in Scotland that the whole sector has worked together to sort of recognise the outcomes that young people achieve, and also the skills and attributes they pick up from coming through the youth work process.
And what sort of skills, what role does youth work play in supporting children in terms of developing those skills? Perhaps you could give an example of the types of youth work that's carried out.
Yeah, so it looks different in different places. So youth work takes place in community centres, in schools. It can even happen in prisons and in hospitals. And it's very much about, I suppose there's targeted youth work interventions, also universal provision. It could be digital youth work, it could be face-to-face contact, relationship building, it could be very specific educational and accreditation type opportunities through things like the Duke of Edinburgh's Award and Youth Achievement Awards. So it's quite kind of broad-based, but it's all in that space of informal education and supporting young people to develop their skills, their understanding, and the opportunity to achieve and realise their full potential.
And you've mentioned that there's quite a diverse range of types of youth work. Are there any particular groups of children or cohorts of children and young people that it's particularly beneficial for?
So yes, it's a 12 to 25 is the age spread, I suppose, predominantly 12 to 18 in terms of youth work. So that adolescent period is quite important. There are, through many of our uniformed youth organisations and bigger charities like YMCA, they're also working with children as well, from 8 to 11 years old. So I think one of the key aspects of what we do is probably around transition points, P7 into S1, also from school into career and employability, college and universities. So yeah, but predominantly 11 to 18, but we look at the full 12 to 25 spectrum.
Thank you. And the inquiry's heard quite a lot about the importance of transition points and transitions and support offered then. What role does youth work play in relation to those transitions points?
So a variety of roles. It could be kind of residential opportunities for children and young people to support them in the transition. It could be connecting with schools and working alongside them to build young people's confidence and their skills in and around those spaces. At the other end, in terms of employability and skills, it's very much part of that wider career support and advice from Skills Development Scotland and others, thinking about ways that young people can understand their own personal and professional journey and how they're supported into the next steps around that.
Thank you. You've touched on just the types of youth work that there are, but in general terms, could you give an overview of what pre-pandemic youth work looked like in terms of how it was delivered and where? You've touched on schools, etc. But if you could give a little bit more detail on some of the spaces that youth work was delivered in and how it was delivered, face-to-face, digitally, etc., outdoors.
So predominantly face-to-face delivery for youth work through often group work exercises and activities. It's in youth centres, in schools, in community buildings, and also in specific targeted programmes as well. So yeah, it kind of looks different in different places, but it's that common thread around, as I say, the outcomes that we're trying to achieve for young people and with young people. It's very much about putting young people first, sort of working with them in their own learning journey, and kind of understanding what their needs are and matching the programme to them. So a lot of youth work activity is co-developed and co-produced with children and young people.
And what is the relationship then between the youth workers and children and young people?
Yeah, so that is, I think, the relationship-based aspect to that is quite important. It is very much about understanding young people and what their needs are, and having the time to do that. Quite often youth work is, as well as some youth work taking place in the school day in schools and also outside of schools, predominantly it's in the evenings and weekends and in holiday periods that a lot of youth work takes place. So the relationship first aspect is really important. So we're part of a wider, youth work in Scotland is part of a wider profession around community learning and development, and it's very much, the values and ethics of what we're about is about putting communities first, listening to the needs, auditing the needs of the community. So from a youth work and young people point of view, that is very much listening to what young people's needs are, what they're looking for, and trying to adapt our programmes to meet their needs.
And you mentioned some of your members are local authorities and that they provide youth work, and then you mentioned other organisations that are not, are more private ones, like I think you mentioned Scouts. We're certainly hearing from them later, Scouts Scotland. What is the relationship between those private youth work organisations and local authorities? Do they work in the same way that you've described there?
So yes, there's a lot of collectivism around working together to get the best needs for children and young people. In a local community, obviously we've got the national Scouts, but in terms of local and regional bodies, there would be a real interest in working together to make sure that activity is planned around each other, so that services are not clashing with each other, that they're providing the right kinds of activity at different times of the day. At a national level, YouthLink's role is to sort of bring people together and be a collective voice, and to make sure that networks are working with each other strategically. So in each local authority there's a community learning plan where the local authority will consider where it needs to target its resource and need for children and young people. But often that is done in partnership with the voluntary sector and the other agencies that are supporting children and young people through different methods. I mean, I've said, face-to-face group work, but there's also digital activity, detached youth work as well, going onto the streets and meeting young people where they are at, and a range of different sort of outreach services as well.
And just detached youth work, could you explain a bit? You mentioned it's going out to meet children in the street or where they are. Could you explain what that looks like and what types of support are offered through that?
Yeah, so that's very much about just, again, making connections, making relationships, but also signposting young people to maybe services that might be, where there may be need. Quite often detached connects to services connect to sort of local intelligence from police and other agencies about where some young people who are maybe facing difficulties or who may be at risk of antisocial behaviour or so on. It's kind of a way to sort of dispel those things and make sure that young people are supported and signposted into youth centres and other places where support can happen.
And the organisations that provide that specific type of support, do they provide other youth work services as well, or are there specific organisations that deliver that?
So there's both and. There are some organisations that will work specifically with young people at the margins, organisations like Rock Trust working with young people that are, and young adults and young people that are homeless. So there are some targeted specialist provision, but there's also generic youth work organisations will also do some detached youth work in weekends or in the summers. I have to say this looks quite varied in terms of budget and in terms of what the financial constraints are on the sector as to how much that happens or doesn't happen.
Thank you. So we've got an idea of what youth work looked like pre-pandemic or generally. We're going to go on to discuss matters relating to the move to digital provision, but could you please describe in general terms what youth work looked like during the pandemic?
So I think during the pandemic, clearly youth work was unable to attend, young people were unable to attend youth work in schools or community centres. So there was a real importance that, that youth work pivoted and repositioned its offer. One of the good things about youth work, because it's needs-led and very much working with young people, is that it acted very quickly in that regard. So there's a lot of creative offers for children and young people. Things like, again, we talked about detached youth work, but actually youth work is getting on bicycles and going and taking kind of maybe either food provision or activity packs to the homes of children and young people so that they could engage in those services that were being offered. The biggest change, of course, was to online and to digital. We as an agency have led on digital youth work. We've got a number of programmes that run across the EU at YouthLink. And we set up a website called digitalyouthwork.scot, and that was very much about sharing kind of resources and intelligence across the sector so that we could provide that digital youth work for young people and also youth work outdoors. I would say there's some other aspect of this though where the agility of the youth work service, because it maybe wasn't it's not so set as formal school where you've got a day-to-day curriculum and you've got subjects you're teaching, did mean that youth workers were pulled into things like food banks, community hubs in terms of where they were being supporting young people from key workers during that period. They also were sometimes supporting residential care if there was too many numbers off in terms of social workers, and connecting with vulnerable children and young people in lots of different ways. So I think there was more targeting of the support and provision, but at the same time youth work was quite stretched. There was people taken into lots of different activities to cover for other staff, especially in the local authorities I'm talking about.
Oh, okay, so you said pulled into, I was going to ask you about that. So that was more in relation to local authorities redistributing their staff.
Yeah.
And then what about the non-local authority youth work sector? What other work did they do beyond, traditional youth work during the pandemic?
So I think, yes, the online and digital resources and packs were quite important. Matched with activity packs, it was quite creative in terms of connecting with young people, as well in terms of detached and that I've mentioned, but also outdoor experiences. So especially in those when we were permitted to do things outdoor but with social distancing, all kinds of sort of youth work activities to make those social connections and create opportunities for fun and connection was very much kind of to the fore.
Thank you. We'll come on to discuss that in a bit more detail. If we could turn now just to look at, consider the role of YouthLink Scotland during the pandemic. You discussed this at paragraphs 22 to 26 of your report, and then again up to paragraph 47. So if we could start first looking at, you said that as the National Agency for Youth Work, you played a role in leading the sector's approach to the COVID-19 response and recovery. And then you go on to describe at paragraph 23 that YouthLink Scotland quickly established a national youth work recovery group. that met regularly in connection with specific themes. Could you please explain who was included in that group?
Yeah, so that was representatives from the voluntary sector and from local authorities. It included a mix of managers and senior practitioners, so it had a good granularity in terms of mixed understandings of what was actually happening, and it was pulled from all across Scotland. When I said that we responded quickly, we had already been doing hybrid things with Zoom and so on, so we were ready as an agency very quickly to move to that and to encourage the sector to get onto those platforms and to communicate if they weren't already. So we had a weekly meeting initially that went to fortnightly and then monthly of that recovery group, and it was just a fantastic source of intelligence. I think we were able to get the full spectrum from rural places, from the Highlands and Islands, and also urban areas, and the sort of different challenges that were occurring in different places. So it's a great funnel for intelligence sharing, but also for support for youth workers and leaders and managers to share understanding, to share resources that were working in certain places really well. And we used that then also to feed into Scottish Government.
So was that the purpose of setting it up, was this intelligence gathering, sharing of information?
Yes, it was. And I guess as an agency, networks are quite important for what we do. So we have a local authority managers network, a voluntary organisations network, we have a digital youth network, we have a research network. So these opportunities for practitioners to come together were there previously, but for this we wanted to bring together groups specifically focused on COVID and pulling together, as I said, those that had different sort of understandings and skill sets in that space, so we had a kind of a rich mix of understanding and intelligence.
And I think are you able to summarise some of the key topics and issues that were discussed?
So that's quite broad range. I think it would be looking at the agenda would I think it's probably in the witness statement, but would look at what kind of guidance was there was one of the key things, I suppose. What was government saying, and how did we understand and make sense of that in a youth work context? Where was the financial support on offer? There was a number of programmes that government were looking at to develop, whether community-based funding for third sector or maybe funding for staff being furloughed. We would look at mental health issues for children and young people. I mean, the priority was the impact on children and young people, because that's what our job is, to support and think about how youth work is supporting young people. So where were the challenges? What were the specific new barriers that were coming in, and how could we overcome those barriers and challenges? So that was a continual discussion. Over time it became more and more specific around the nuances of guidance and helping people to really understand that and to communicate clearly, because although we had overarching guidance, given that youth work sat across a number of different places, it was important to sort of communicate that. You had facilities-based guidance, you had guidance for faith communities, you had guidance for schools, and guidance for play. And so youth work was actually inhabiting a number of different spaces, so it was quite important that we were able to give clarity as to what that meant in the context of youth work.
Thank you. And you mentioned that, first of all, to what extent did that group enable YouthLink Scotland to influence Scottish Government and public health guidance in the youth work sector? I think you mentioned you fed in. What was the sort of nature and extent of that feeding in and collaboration?
So that was very regular, and I think it was well received, and we certainly government were very keen to hear. They were keen for us to do surveys for the sector as well, and to kind of understand what the sector was grappling with and what some of the issues were. There was a community learning and development leadership group that we fed into initially, and then I was directly feeding into the advanced learning and science recovery group as part of COVID. So we had that chance to speak directly to the Minister and to others that were leading on this. In terms of public health and the engagement back and forward, that was the ability to kind of have conversations about what might be, what the government was thinking around what could be in the next iteration of guidance, and what would that. So it was an opportunity to sort of test things out. And for us as a sector to say what kind of would and wouldn't work, and what would work better, and how we could communicate that. So it was very much a back and forward conversation with our government colleagues.
And I think you mentioned something about it improving over time. Did that get better as that communication and that collaboration improve over time, or was it consistently the same throughout?
Yes, I think it did. You know, I think as you know, I think there was a regular and open opportunity for feedback and communication. Over time as well, I think government tried to sort of limit the numbers of guidance going out into more fewer aspects of guidance, so that there wasn't too many overlapping or potentially kind of maybe slightly confusing mixed messaging across some of those communications.
We'll come on to discuss later on in the discussion some of the issues or the impacts for YouthLink Scotland in relation to guidance and timing and ability to respond meaningfully. But if we could move on next to discuss some of the key resources that YouthLink Scotland was involved in providing. You mentioned at paragraph 26 to 30 that group allowed you to develop resources, and that included guidance for the youth work sector. Could you please describe or explain what some of those key resources were?
Yeah, so it is things like for mental health and wellbeing resources, sharing learning around some of the activity there, detached youth work guidance. So quite often people had things in different places, and part of that is propriety, so part of that is different people owning different aspects of what they were doing or training. So there's very much an opportunity to share those resources and make sure that everybody had the latest kind of knowledge and intelligence. We developed a lot of kind of training around digital and how to do digital well and safely, and also around, I say, mental health and wellbeing resources, but also around education resources as well.
You then also describe at paragraphs 31 to 47 some of the funding programs that YouthLink administered on behalf of the Scottish Government to support young people. Broadly, what was YouthLink's role in administering the funds? We will come on to discuss impacts in more detail, but if you could please outline what YouthLink's role was in administering the funds, and then perhaps explain what some of those funds were aimed at addressing, what impacts those funds were aimed at addressing.
So, providing funding to youth work is something that we were doing pre-pandemic, and it was, I think we had a good model of often peer assessed, and also with young people involved in making assessments for where funding was distributed to, and quite often, small grants-based programs and projects. Things like cashback for communities is an example of the sector doing that well pre-pandemic. So those were the key things, I suppose. The fact that it was peer assessed, the fact that the money went quickly to where the need was greatest, and this strong outcomes came with those funds as well. So there was never a case where we saw money that was coming back the way into us, because people were able to see the need, identify it clearly, and spend it. So a lot of that was based on a history of understanding and trust, and peer assessment is actually quite robust, I would say, as a model, because people can who know exactly what money can be spent of can see the best use and best allocation of that resource.
And in terms of who it was being distributed to, was that being distributed to your members?
So it's for the sector. So it's not exclusive to YouthLink members. Most of the sector is represented through YouthLink Scotland, either directly or through some of the national bodies. So you might be a local YMCA is connected to the national YMCA, and then YMCA is represented in YouthLink Scotland. But it wasn't exclusive to your members, no, it was to anyone in the youth work sector.
And just in terms of YouthLink's role in administering the funds, were you distributing those funds or just involved in negotiating them?
Yes, no, we were involved in distributing the funds.
Thank you. And if we could just have a look at some of the funds, please, and just give an indication of what impacts they were aimed at addressing. So, for example, I'm assuming the clue's in the name, but the CLD Digital Inclusion Fund, what was that?
Yeah, so there was a wider Connecting Scotland support and fund for around devices for children that I think SCVO were involved in running, but there was a specific kind of gap for younger adults that we were noticing, young kind of community adult learning, sort of 16 plus age range, and that's what the fund was dedicated to. So we worked along with Leeds Scotland and the Workers' Education Association to make sure that, again, the kind of the technology went to young adult learners. Leeds Scotland in particular are experts in devices for young people that need assistance with certain disabilities. So that was really helpful, and we made sure that again it was just a gap that we were picking up in our part of the world where young people were missing out on some of the devices. Not every young person was going to school, so the school programs were not working for every child and young person. So finding other ways to get devices to young people who were not maybe yet registered in a college but in an in-between place was quite important.
And then you mentioned specifically the Social Isolation and Loneliness Fund in your statement. Could you please explain what that was aimed at addressing?
So certainly that was for, I guess we were recognising that young people were facing loneliness and isolation. Sometimes traditionally that perspective is that maybe it was older people who were being more isolated, but actually young people themselves were also experiencing that, and I guess that's shown as well through some of the findings we have around the mental health and well-being of young people more broadly. But that specific fund was, again, targeted to those that knew about, families in really at risk in terms of poverty, or, in terms of, clothing. It was a very flexible fund to meet sort of needs in local communities that those that were working closely with communities and families would know about and would be able to really target that need and support.
Thank you. And perhaps if we can just touch on one more before we move on, the Outdoor Education Recovery Fund.
So yes, that was a really important fund. I guess what we noticed was that outdoor centres, we were getting feedback that they were in a particularly difficult place. They were not able to access some of either the business funding or the community support funding that was available. It just didn't work for them because they had an income generation aspect to what they did in terms of bookings for residential centres, an element of income there. They were not-for-profit agencies, so they weren't private businesses. And there was a sense in which those outdoor centres were at real jeopardy and threat of closure during this period, which was going to have a significant impact on the educational offer for all children and young people. I think over time that there'd been a pressure already in terms of school groups and visits, maybe not having as many visits to residential and outdoor centres, and then during COVID this really came home as an industry, if you like, that was under threat. If you put that alongside the fact that outdoor opportunities was actually one of the few things that could happen for children and young people, in a safe way, there was an opportunity to invest in that, and government saw that opportunity through the Outdoor Education Recovery Fund. And again, it was about young people having those opportunities to develop their wider educational skills and opportunities through outdoor experiences. It was very well, it had a really big impact in terms of, I think, again, schools and others maybe who have not been doing so much of that, seeing the impact on young people's confidence, their well-being, and just generally their happiness and energy to come back and return to school as well, because I think the experiences of school for many young people through digital only, especially during lockdown periods, was quite a lonely process, and for some young people they completely disconnected. So having outdoor centres to support young people's well-being and then help them re-enter education, formal education, was really important.
Thank you. If we could touch on then, you mentioned at paragraphs 40 to 47, you described some of the work YouthLink did with the Scottish Government to deliver a national food insecurity pilot. And you referred to a national insecurity pilot, and then you also referred to a pilot program in the school holidays. Was that the same program, or those two different programs?
So it was the same program, but just to be clear, this was something that was agreed before the pandemic hit, and so it was moved into the summer, period, because of the pandemic, and so there's a readjustment to the sort of nature of the delivery. I guess there was a wide recognition that food poverty affects learning and learning loss. This came very much from a learning loss point of view. What happened, especially during the summer periods, where that was again something that we recognise that some young people who from maybe impoverished backgrounds are facing food insecurity. What was the impact of that on their learning? So we worked along with a number of different partners. It was a government-funded project. and we worked with regional improvement collaboratives, and there was an opportunity for flexibility again in terms of leadership. It was very much voluntary organisations, statutory working together, a mixed model, and the approach was again looking at how we can build young people's skills, their health and well-being, but also there was an opportunity for that connection with trusted adults, people who already knew some of the families and communities that were struggling around this in their local area, and to tailor the need and the provision for that. It was really successful. About 92% of young people improved their mental well-being through the pilot, and 80% expressed that they were keen to return to school as well when they were off school through lockdown. So it had, a really good impact.
And you mentioned at paragraph 42, your evaluation of the pilot programs underlined the effectiveness of a youth work approach to tackling food insecurity and learning loss among young people and their families, which I think you've discussed some of there. This included purposely designing activities to be fun, engaging and responsive to participants' interest, and having fun was essential for drawing and maintaining interest. So was that all part of that delivery of that programme?
Yes, it was, and I think that approach, the different maybe pedagogy of an approach in terms of relationship first, and then the education and the support around food comes as part of the process, and is absolutely the approach that was taken.
Thank you. You then mentioned at paragraph 48 to 52 the role that YouthLink played in relation to surveys. And at paragraph 48 and following, you mentioned the work done with the Scottish Youth Parliament, Children in Scotland, and the Children's Parliament in hearing directly from from young people on the pandemic as it affected them. And you referred to the key survey being the lockdown lowdown. We'll come on later to discuss some of the impacts and issues highlighted in that survey when we discuss impacts on children and young people, which you then describe at paragraph 113 and following. But for now, would you please explain how YouthLink became involved and what that survey involved? What was it looking at, and how was it carried out?
Yeah, so it was that particular survey was Young Scot, Scottish Youth Parliament, and YouthLink Scotland, and it was very much what are young people thinking? What are young people feeling right now? There was a sense maybe at the beginning as well of the process that some of the progress around young people's voice and young people's rights, and building from the Year of Young People, which in Scotland, which was all about co-developing activities and services with children and young people. That during this period, in the rush, the emergency rush to get things established and organised, is that young people's voices could be left behind. So that was, I suppose, very much in the DNA of Young Scot and YouthLink and the Youth Parliament to reach out and hear exactly what young people were saying. And we have the kind of success of having those connections through many of the youth work organisations as well, to support that, as well as setting the questions to support that in terms of encouraging young people to fill it in. The young people, there's other sources of intelligence, I suppose, through Public Health Scotland. Quite often they're based on studies that happen in school during the school day, and sort of national studies to sort of capture some of that data, and that was maybe deprioritised a little bit, I'm not sure, but in terms of that period, in terms of some of the emergency response. So this was very much welcomed as an opportunity to speak directly to young people, and I think we had about 2,500 responses to the first one in April 2020. 6,000 in November 2020, and another 2,500 young people responding in June 21. So there's different phases and stages of the lockdown process.
Thank you. Further in relation to surveys, you refer at paragraph 51 to a survey which relates to access to facilities, and again we'll come on later to discuss some of the findings and particularly the impacts and issues experienced by members in relation to access to facilities. But could you please explain for now what that survey involved and what YouthLink's role was in relation to that survey?
So yes, again, this is where sort of building intelligence from those COVID recovery groups was recognising that this was an area that we needed to survey and get more data on, because we were recognising that young people and youth work activity was not taking place in the way that it could and should have been, in terms of the permission as part of an educational offer to be there for children and young people. Sorry, what was your question specifically?
Sorry, it was just what was YouthLink's role and what was the purpose of that survey, what it involved?
So it was just about finding out what access was to community facilities across the country for youth work, and to see what some of the barriers were that were preventing sort of safe indoor working, which was permitted. So we did 4 different surveys between 2020 and 2022. And I think you said we'll go on to that in a bit, but it was, again, working with the sector to get that intelligence, and again, to do that in a rich way, as well as the stats, to get some of the qualitative information about what some of the nuances of different types of barriers to open access to youth work.
Thank you. And then finally, you mentioned at paragraph 52 a survey that YouthLink carried out called Scotland's Youth Work Sector. Again, we'll come on later to discuss some of the findings which you describe in paragraph 117, but please could you explain again what the purpose of that survey was, what it involved, and what YouthLink's involvement was.
So yes, again, it's just to understand fully how it was impacting the youth work sector and how the youth work sector was ready to respond to the needs for children and young people. So the questions went through all of those aspects, and I think we were discovering some of the challenges that the sector was facing, maybe in terms of funding, but also in terms of volunteer numbers, in terms of how many people were coming back into the profession. So there was a kind of just give us a holistic view of a number of the different issues that the sector was facing around funding, around facilities, around mental health support, how they were accessing or not accessing some of the support and provision that was being provided.
Thank you. If we could move on now to discuss the move to online and digital youth work provision, which we've touched on already. We've already discussed some of the benefits of face-to-face youth work. But there was something you mentioned in the earlier discussion, which is quite an important point, about not all children and young people are in education. Could you please explain the sort of importance of youth work, and in particular face-to-face youth work, for children who've perhaps either, and I'm not talking about children who've left education, but perhaps have disengaged or don't engage as well with education as some of their peers?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely vital. I think youth work, and there is some funded work from government around this in terms of closing the attainment gap between those that are doing, from who are more deprived compared to other young people. There's quite a gap in Scotland. So in terms of the Scottish Attainment Challenge, that's a big driver. And of course, to be engaged is also to actually attend school, first of all. So attendance rates, drop quite considerably. But there's always been a very much a youth work in schools approach to that, and working closely with schools to provide alternative opportunities to connect with young people and have educational opportunities, to maybe look at some of the other ways that they can get a credit and achievement if they're not going to school. But the focus is to support young people back into the formal education system. That's clearly what youth work wants to do. And what you will see, and especially in some areas, is that there's kind of funding and support from different sources, as you said, private charity organisations, to work along with young people to provide youth workers. There's also youth workers in school or home school support workers as well in some local authorities, where there's that connection to the family, and to understand why a young person is not attending, and to give support and other opportunities for them to re-engage in education. But also sometimes provide that education as well, or provide some education while they're not getting the full school experience, or provide pathways into college and other partnerships. And
what sort of education would they be providing?
So that again is hugely varied. I mean, some of it is about at some stages it's not direct education, it's maybe just mental health and wellbeing support and connections. But in other cases it can be all the way to a fully SQA approved programme that can be run in a youth centre rather than in a school. So yeah, there's a range of different. I mean, there's the awards network provides. There's about 40 different award providers. If you look at even in some of our uniformed organisations, there's accreditation and possibilities through that, through organisations like Cadets. So there's other places that young people are able to, create achievement to get on the Scottish Credit and Qualifications framework, and have a kind of way into their, development in terms of their learning and pathways. But so there's the aspect of direct stuff that they can do, but also, and it's educational in and of itself in terms of some of the youth work activity, it's then given credit to that. So things like Youth Achievement Awards and I can name a whole lot of them, but again, that's very much part of the youth work DNA, to support young people who may not be thriving or are vulnerable or not achieving in the formal education system.
Thank you. Just in terms of pivoting to online digital youth work, how easy or difficult was that for members, and could you describe what sort of things they experienced and had to do to deliver that online youth work during the pandemic, or during lockdown certainly?
Yeah, so it was difficult, but I think by May, 92% of the sector were delivering online in the early part of the lockdown, but that would look very different in different places, and there were significant barriers to that. One of the things that we, in terms of one of those surveys that was discussed earlier, Youth Work Sector Survey, we discovered that 60% of local youth work services were identifying digital barriers to accessing activity with young people, and that was something that we flagged. Maybe you'll come on to that in terms of we did write to the Deputy First Minister at the time about that issue. There was a lot of data poverty as well, so young people in some places through schools and some of the programmes might have access to a device, but they didn't necessarily have the broadband and coverage for that. So there's a real focus on digital inclusion and ensuring that young people had access to those activities. Specifically for youth work, I think one of our challenges was that we could see, again, because we have both sides of the sector feeding into us, we could see that the voluntary sector had tapped into some of the platforms and that young people were using in terms of Discord and Zoom quite quickly. In terms of local authorities, some of the corporate, there was a bit more of a corporate lockdown, understandably, around some of those tools, but actually for those that were engaging directly for children and young people and that couldn't do it through the corporate local authority offer, they needed to be able to be on these platforms. So I suppose youth workers were facing that dilemma of using some of their own devices, and we thought this is not something that's sustainable. We want to ensure that these devices are used and fully accessible for support in terms of youth work.
Thank you. We'll come on to discuss in a bit more detail in a minute the digital inclusion issues, and also those issues you touch on in relation to local authorities restricting certain platforms. But were there particular concerns amongst youth workers about, despite the successful move to online relatively quickly, about loss to our face-to-face youth work per se?
Oh, absolutely. The dynamic changed significantly, and so not having that in-person contact, and it wasn't a case of online and nothing, I suppose, because there was still that opportunity for some outdoor or detached sort of connection with young people. But yeah, that did obviously have a big bearing, because the nature of activities and group work and some of the fun icebreakers and things that you associate with traditional youth work, they just become more difficult to do online. I think there was a recognition as well that for young people, especially for looking for evening or other activity, they maybe had to be online through school during the day, so it turned it into a sort of different platform for them in terms of maybe they had, I think we all had sort of Teams and Zoom and digital fatigue at some times in terms of that connection. However, I would say that there was a significant amount of creativity in that space as well, in terms of using the technology well, and certainly we were trying to support and drive that with some of our knowledge from what was going on across Europe in terms of some of the interesting ways that you can use digital technology to engage young people.
Thank you. Just coming back to digital, or before we go on to digital inclusion issues, safeguarding issues. Were there any particular safeguarding issues highlighted by your members in relation specifically to the use of online platforms to deliver youth work?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. There is that thing about, of course, the professional and personal boundaries of that, and ensuring that young people weren't, that there was a clear guideline about what was appropriate, what was not appropriate around. So a number of guides that we already had were being shared and developed as well, so that organisations could look at best practice in that space. And I suppose we're trying to avoid that. Young people having, I suppose, seeking out the individual Facebook and other social media platforms that people were on, and making sure there was a sort of separation of professional boundaries. A lot of this stuff had been written, but I suppose the fact that everybody is on digital and online, and we were using it more, meant that needed more focus and more attention. So we were doing a lot around guidelines in that space. On the other side, from a young person point of view, there was understandably caution about about youth workers coming into their own space, into their own personal space. You can do amazing things with your camera to make sure that you've got backgrounds that you're not seeing what the home is like and so on, and that and what a young person might want to show or not show. So all of those things were considered in a lot of detail and depth. And there was a kind of a learning around all of that as well, in terms of we also watched the technology improve, I suppose, as we went to sort of ensure privacy and to have different ways of connecting.
Thank you. And just in relation to digital inclusion issues, could you please just explain what some of those, you've already touched on them, but both in terms of devices and data poverty, if you could explain how widespread those issues were amongst the youth, children and young people that your organisations were engaging with, and if there were any particular groups that were faced problems more than others, just in terms of location or demographic.
Yes, so in terms of certain demographics of young people where they have less access, it can seem that maybe they're given as I mentioned before, maybe they're giving an iPad from school, but they don't have maybe the full data support initially, at least, and or an understanding of how to use the technology. Sometimes we can make a sort of sweeping assumption that young people are tech savvy, but actually there's a lot of difference in terms of how young people are understanding that. We say every young person has a mobile phone, but not every young person has a smart mobile phone. So again, it could sort of introduce divides in terms of what young people were willing or not willing to share, because they didn't have quite the same access as other young people who maybe had a much better equipment and were able to sort of use that. So that again was why the sort of the digital poverty and some of the funding around that was really helpful and really useful, because it was focused on getting devices and giving extra support to young people who didn't have good access.
Thank you. And then you've also touched on the issues with local authorities, and I think you mentioned this at paragraph 119, with councils preventing or restricting access to social media, probably understandably, but restricting access to social media and other digital platforms so youth workers couldn't access these, which undermined vital connections with young people. Could you please just elaborate a little bit about some of those difficulties and how they were overcome?
So I guess we did did want to sort of identify that issue, and I think, as I said, I wrote a letter to the Deputy First Minister about that, because we were starting to see this as being a pattern of potential disengagement, and we did see progress over time in terms of local authorities starting to take away some of the restrictions that they had on certain platforms specifically for this process of engagement. There may well be reasons at the corporate level to protect kind of corporate information from state players or cyber incidents and attacks, but actually for children and young people, some of these technologies was the only way that they were connecting. So it was really important that youth workers, if they had no other way of connecting with them, had access and opportunity to use those platforms and devices. And I think we did, as I say, we did see that over time, that it was better, certainly by the second lockdown, in terms of the access that local authorities had, as well as the voluntary sector. The voluntary sector was more flexible, I think, in terms of some of those tools and technologies.
Thank you. And then at paragraph 115, you talk about the fact that digital youth work, in fact, benefited some others, but was some children and young people, but was a barrier to others. Could you please just broadly outline some of those? We'll come on to discuss challenges with return to face-to-face in a minute, but if you could just outline some of the benefits, some of the groups that benefited and some that did not benefit or were disadvantaged.
Yes, I mean, and I'm aware as I say this that it's really hard to generalise because it's very specific. But I did get feedback from Deaf Action that some of the opportunity for young people to see everybody on screen and be able to lip read and to also have a transcript of the conversation, some of that technology actually brought young people into the room more with their peers, and there was a real great opportunity to sort of make connections and to share information and to build relationships. So I think there was opportunities for positive, a reimagining of how we work, a real consideration of quite often with group work activity, it can be in a youth work in an in-person setting, there can always be dominant voices and other young people not being heard so much. So youth workers have got to work hard to make sure everybody is part of that group and everybody is able to engage. So I think digital and online platforms did provide some of that space, but at the same time, as soon as we say that, I think there's other young people, depending on specifically what their own support needs are, would equally have been turned off by the digital screen only opportunity for engagement. So it's a kind of mixed thing that we started to sort of learn and understand more about as we went through the process.
Thank you. If we could now turn to consider other impacts beyond sort of digital poverty-related impacts on children and young people. You've already provided a description of some of the surveys that you undertook, including the Lockdown Lowdown survey, which discusses some of the impacts on children and young people. Could you please just outline some of the impacts in relation specifically to mental health and well-being that were outlined both in relation by that survey, but also just in terms of general engagement with your members through the group you mentioned earlier, and otherwise?
Yes, so I think the first survey, perhaps not surprisingly, young people were very concerned about, and this was an opportunity through the survey, the Lockdown Lowdown, to express that, what their concerns were. 96% of young people were worried about COVID's impact on their future. 77% were worried about their mental health, and 40% were moderately or extremely concerned about their mental health and well-being, and that's in the first couple of months of the pandemic. There were also about half of the young people were also concerned about the impact on their exams and coursework from not being in school. So that was from our first lockdown survey, and I think the concern in and around that area was that we were aware that through the health, behaviour and school study that Scotland, in terms of its mental health and well-being, was not doing so well compared to some of its other European colleagues, and this extra, I suppose, pandemic, that all that came with that, hearing about their concerns was really important for the youth workers to hear and kind of consider, well, what are we doing about that, and how might the social isolation and the lack of connectedness, how might that affect young people, how they get the chance to express that, to talk to other trusted adults out with the kind of their small family unit, where's the opportunity for that to happen?
Thank you. In terms of, you'd mentioned previously social isolation in the context of one of the funds. Again, how widespread was that, or how, to what extent was that identified as an issue in and of itself?
It was, yeah, and I think it's, so small steps of any sort of interaction or activity, things like youth workers actually maybe coming to your door to provide some activity pack and then leave it for you. All of these small, interactions made a huge difference in terms of young people's sense of that they were being listened to, they were being connected, and everything wasn't just about, their school days, kind of school and, home. I mean, home life can be very mixed for different young people. It can be, for every young person, there can be good days and bad days being at home. So being in a place, especially for young people that were shielding and so on, it was clearly a very isolating period. And this was an opportunity to sort of target provision to young people in particular that we were concerned about.
You touch on in paragraph 105, and I don't think it's necessarily with reference to the Lockdown Lowdown report, but issues with behaviour or antisocial behaviour. Are you able to or just explain a bit what those issues were and who was raising them?
So yes, I think this is at different points then when we came out of lockdown, there was a kind of recognition that there was some antisocial behaviour. I mean that in the broadest sense of the word, just slightly not what was expected in terms of children, young people's behaviour. So there was a sense that maybe young people had missed key transition points in particular, and that was having an impact on their behaviour. It was maybe a social immaturity as well in terms of when they did come into spaces again. So there was either a kind of some young people who were maybe continuing to wear face masks when that was a choice that happened throughout society as well, where they maybe didn't need to do that, and that was maybe about covering up their own kind of insecurities sometimes and anxieties around the pandemic. But equally, a kind of unruly behaviour is the best way to describe it in terms of, you're always going to get that on and off with children and young people. But when you're listening to practitioners who are seasoned youth workers who've spent years doing this, when they actually notice this being a bit more than normal and difficult to manage, difficult to control, and they were able to maybe specify certain year groups as well, where, as I say, the transition age range in particular, when we came out of lockdown and recovery, just their re-engagement in some of the process of what was expected in a secondary school classroom versus a primary school classroom, just the nature of that change was there. I think some of this as well, in terms of antisocial behaviour, probably plays out more broadly in society, and also young people not attending school and then finding other ways, and not always positive ways, to channel their energies. That's something that we've probably seen as well since the pandemic.
Thank you. And then in relation to attainment and lost learning, what were the concerns, if any, raised by the children and young people that you surveyed in relation to impacts relating to that?
So yes, young people were, again, the second lowdown survey, where young people were particularly concerned about their employment opportunities and future education pathways. There was obviously a lot of change. They wanted more information about the school and the exam procedures. Many of these things were changing quite regularly, and so young people themselves, again, they were trying to make sense of that, and what did it mean for them? Would they be doing an online assessment? Would they be doing an in-coursework assessment? So all of that just created I think we were able to see a link between concerns around succeeding well in school and mental health and well-being. There seemed to be a clear link between anxieties around achievement and opportunities to do well in school, and what would it mean for the future. And obviously young people, like everyone else, are reading headlines about what's the impact going to be on the economy, what's the impact going to be on jobs once we come out of this period. And in our surveys, young people identified that quite clearly, that they were feeling that anxiety. They were worried about some of the lost learning and pathways. When I say lost learning, I think it's important that we to kind of do recognise at school that teachers and youth workers and everybody involved in colleges and education were doing a lot in terms of online, and working really hard to make sure that young people did not miss out on those opportunities, and programmes were adapted to fit. But there's no doubt in my mind, from the sort of intelligence we've got, that there has been periods of lost learning, and that's because in youth work in particular we really sense that, because we look at it as a broad general education, as we talk about, is that there's those other opportunities for young people to succeed. Some young people who are not succeeding in the traditional pathways, in particular in school, then they often have those opportunities through other programmes that happen in and around a school day, and after school clubs and in the evening activities. So a lot of those things were limited, and that therefore also connected into their own achievement.
Food insecurity we've touched on already. You've mentioned the pilot programme in the school holidays targeting those at risk of food poverty and learning loss, and I think you'd mentioned that was something that was planned prior to the pandemic. But could you possibly explain, just again in a bit more detail, some of the impacts that was designed to address, and whether and to what extent those impacts were exacerbated or during the course of the pandemic?
So yes, I think they were, and when that was one particular pilot working in quite a focused way around exploring the issue. But there was a lot of other youth work organisations that sort of pivoted towards so there was organisations before like Scran Academy and Magic Breakfast who were doing a lot of kind of food provision. But I think more increasingly we saw other youth work organisations recognising that food was a real issue for children and young people. Again, we've always had that issue a bit in and around the school day, where if there's not school meals and so on, how is that, or how are young people picking up on that? So that was something that a lot of youth organisations kind of stepped into that space, and tried to either take food to young people at their homes or provide outdoor activities where food was then added to the experience. So if they were already doing a kind of outdoor group session in a in whatever setting, that food was part of that, was that you made it available and accessible to the children and young people. It's not gone away. I mean, food poverty is clearly a wider issue for everyone, and I think there was just that recognition when the system, if you like, of schools and free school meals and so on wasn't running, and the pre-breakfast clubs and the after-school clubs, then there was a real concern about food insecurity. And I think Youth Work, as well as many other agencies, stepped into that space and started to adapt their services towards that.
Thank you. And then just finally, in relation to impacts on children and young people, the inquiry is particularly interested in hearing about disproportionate impacts on particular groups. Are you able to outline any disproportionate or groups that were disproportionately impacted as a consequence of the loss of face-to-face youth work and or schooling education?
Yes. So I guess young people with additional support needs, young people from the care justice background, young carers, young people of colour or BME communities, we did see disproportional impacts. And actually the second lockdown survey specifically had focus groups with those groups of young people to understand what the particular challenges that they were having. If you looked at something with like young people with additional support needs, or we were recognising that some of those workers were not in schools in the same way during this period, or speech and language therapists were not in. So a lot of these things were, when youth work was still happening, was picking up on issues that we would imagine other professionals would be picking up on during the normal course of the school day. I think BME communities in particular, it's something that in terms of how connected if they didn't have those opportunities and connections, it had a really significant impact on them. And I think we probably understood as a sector that we needed to do far more in terms of making sure that that youth work provision was going to all young people, and that some communities were not specifically mentioned, missing out. And we've recently set up a few years ago the United Voices Collective, again working specifically with charities that are supporting young people of colour who want to work as well with a cohort group specifically just for young people of colour, as well as sort of mixed groups that are happening in youth work. So I guess we learned a lot around making sure that all of youth work and youth work provision was getting out to where it needed to get to during this period. And then added to that, of course, as well as those issues, there are New Scots as well, and the New Scots strategy. So that has added to the need to make sure that youth work is in every place and space and represents all young people, and we have the kind of the resource clearly targeted towards that, so that some communities are not feeling more isolated than others if they're not supported by a particular youth organisation or community group.
Thank you. If we could come on now just to discuss some of the impacts on youth work organisations, youth workers and the youth work sector. You refer to the role that youth work played from 1974 onwards and some of the challenges for the youth work and children of the move to remote learning. But I think we touched on the issue of access to facilities and premises earlier on. And I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that was an issue in relation to coming back into face-to-face learning and some of the challenges around that. You describe the reasons for and issues experienced by youth work organisations in relation to access to facilities and premises during and immediate following the pandemic, paragraphs 94 to 101. Could you please just explain some of the restrictions on access to facilities and what the reasons for those were?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, I guess in Scotland in particular, dedicated youth centres are something that we don't have as much of as compared to other countries. We recently had a visit from Bavaria in Germany, and they were kind of noting that the lack of kind of dedicated purpose-built youth centres is something that we had in the past. The reason for that has been sort of community schools and community buildings being open for all groups to use, and I suppose making use of all facilities. But during this period, I think that actually did become a bit of an issue because youth work organisations and charities didn't have dedicated spaces to meet, so I think one of the obviously some of that is community halls owned by private organisations or by voluntary organisations, community halls, faith-based groups and charities. Some of the community centres as well. Many of these were there's just such a wide variety of reasons, so it'll take me a bit of time to get into it, but I mean some of the things where some of those community centres were used as vaccine centres, so therefore they weren't open for any activity. Schools were prioritised in terms of cleaning, and that's both the budget for cleaning and cleaning staff. So some of the answers that we had about some of the community buildings not being opened up to youth work activity was, well, sorry, we don't have any more budget. We've focused on schools. We don't have the budget to open up these facilities. As they were multi-mixed facilities, there was also concern about, well, we can't have young people mixing with older people or opening that activity. So that was again a frustration, I suppose, from a youth work point of view, because age restrictions meant that young people were able to engage in some of this. If it was educational activity in youth work rather than unregulated work, they were able to engage, but they weren't able to sort of access some of the buildings and centres to do that. And schools as well were quite tightly defined, even though they could open in the evening and weekends. We were sometimes left in the youth work sector with it being at the discretion of a head teacher and their understanding of what youth work meant. So to give you a bit of an anecdote, if somebody understood, oh, they're doing the Duke of Edinburgh's award and that's accredited award, so that's fine, we'll open it for that, but we'll not open it for these other youth organisations that are doing some other things. But just because, it shouldn't have been limited by the frame of a particular understanding of what the needs were. There's issues around ventilation as well, insurance premiums. So there was a range of different things. I think some, again, schools and so on got support around ventilation. The youth work sector, that's not one, we didn't have a specific fund that people could tap into to make the right kinds of adjustments in some of the community halls. There may have been one community fund, but there wasn't enough to cover those. So it's a kind of a wide range of issues, but I suppose when we surveyed the sector, we were just concerned that there was a very slow opening up, even though the government had said, yeah, absolutely, youth work should be happening. It's an educational response as well as schools. And one of the things that really sort of challenged me was that at one point 70% of our third sector owned private community halls and so on had opened, but 40% of the public sector buildings had opened. So that was quite a differentiation given what the need for using those spaces were. So in terms of countering that, one of the things that we did a statement with the Minister and COSLA to talk about the importance of youth work, parity of esteem, to ensure that facilities and buildings were open for youth work activity to take place. But I think part of this is probably a deeper issue for the sector in terms of being seen as truly an essential sector that's really important for the educational provision and the well-being of children and young people. And maybe it's just worth saying at this point, I don't know if you'll come to it later, but in England, and maybe I think the Republic of Ireland, they had dedicated youth work as essential workers, as key workers. In Scotland, some youth workers may be key workers or considered that if they were supporting a community hub and the local authority decided, but as across the board, youth workers weren't given that same sort of appreciation as being essential workers. And it's kind of something that is very much part of the sort of the intelligence sharing within the youth work community, is that the need to strengthen the statutory basis for youth work and consider the importance of it in the wider educational establishment is crucial, and it's something certainly that our sector is calling for a kind of a stronger right to youth work activity, and for youth workers to be, I suppose, protected in terms of their numbers of workforce and so on.
Thank you. You just touching on a couple of the things you mentioned there. You suggested essentially a postcode lottery in terms of whether they were recognised as key workers or not. You also mentioned with the Duke of Edinburgh being something that was recognised and that was allowed, whereas other youth work was not allowed. To what extent was this slow return or the hindering of return to face-to-face, and particularly in relation to the premises, underpinned by a lack of understanding on the part of either local authorities and or government of the important role that youth work plays, and to what extent has that changed since?
So yeah, I think it is partly as a slow return, but there was a University of Edinburgh study which we were part of a COVID study for government, and there was one specifically from the University of Edinburgh that identified that there was a real parity of esteem issue here between youth work and formal education, and a recognition of the importance of youth work. So, there was one or two chief executives and local authorities I spoke to at different times with a different appreciation. Some people looked at it very much as purely a social engagement, and therefore, I think someone had said to me, "Oh, well, we wouldn't be doing those sorts of activities because in the run up to Christmas, social interaction and mingling," and it was a kind of disrespect of, in a sense, in terms of. Youth workers had worked really hard around all of the guidance, all the provision around the safe distancing and measurements that they needed to do to readjust their buildings. So I suppose some of it was just about slow return, and in some cases I can absolutely understand the priority around formal education in schools to get those activities running. But youth work was, for some young people, youth work was their educational opportunity, and so there was a number of factors where it was left too much, I suppose, at the discretion of decision makers locally, which is why we wanted to. Well, we did a campaign nationally as well around youth work needs a home, and we had kind of media and TV interest in that as well. It was something that was connecting across the UK, not just in Scotland. That need for safe places and spaces for young people to connect. And it just seemed to be that every time there was a number of really challenging issues that I appreciate that people that were holding those premises or had authority around those premises were taking. But I have to, that stat, as I said, around those that had owned their own premises were having to pay for their own extra insurance premiums and other things to get those buildings opened up for children and young people. And I think part of it was this shared facility thing, the concern, well, we can't open it for young people if we're not opening it for other people. Well, yes, you could during this period, but there's lots of challenges around cleaning costs and so on. There was cases where some volunteer organisations had their equipment stored in local government, facilities, and weren't able to go and even access their equipment to come and do the work with children and young people. Now, I appreciate I'm telling one or two stories of anecdotes, and that wasn't the picture broadly, but I think it just gives a bit of a picture of some of the frustrations that the sector felt in terms of wanting to kind of get activity up and running with children and young people. It did improve over time.
Thank you. And just on that, in terms of getting children and young people back in to youth work, what could you describe the adaptation of approaches that youth work organisations took to be able to continue supporting children and young people? Obviously, we've touched on the move to digital provision during lockdown, but coming out of lockdown and faced with these challenges, facilities challenges in particular, what were they doing to get around that?
So, again, really creative, often taking on cost themselves into the organisation, sometimes hiring marquees to do employability and skills programmes outside. I certainly visited one in the Highlands around that, where they were kind of not able to use a facility, but actually it was sort of an employability and skills programme for sort of 15, 16-year-olds, and again they were all doing outdoor cooking and all the rest of it, and distancing, face coverings, all of these different things were, considered and were used and were effective in terms of the adaptations. And I suppose the other thing to say is that people were absolutely taking this really seriously in terms of the risk of spread and so on, and of the virus. So lots of precautions were taken around the nature of activity, and certain types of activity that would have been doing were off limits. And it's hard for me to kind of specify more than that, but just you could see lots of change in adaptation to ensure that, and creativity in terms of ensuring that the activity still happened and that young people got something from it.
Thank you. And then you mentioned key worker status being an issue in that postcode lottery, which we've heard about in other contexts, but in practical terms, what did it mean for youth workers who did not have key worker status in terms of delivering youth work or being able to deliver youth work?
So I don't think it prevented them from, delivering the youth work, but I guess you did have situations where people were doing support, but they couldn't have support and provision for their own children and young people. Would be one of the issues if they were out delivering activity, but their young people couldn't access some of those community and after school supports, so they were managing that without having the sort of essential worker status. But I think the other aspect was just that protection of the youth work space, because I suppose maybe especially in local authorities they were being pulled into lots of different types of activity as part of response, which, and I've mentioned as well that happening in terms of food provision, and I suppose that's as it should be. But in another way, teachers in the formal education weren't being pulled into lots of different type of activities. So although it was helpful at the time, people recognised, no, we need to keep the teaching going. We need young people to still have the opportunity to achieve and be accredited. And the concern now is that because some youth work was pulled into different places during that period and supporting other services, whether it be covering for social workers that were off or stepping into different roles, is that at this point a lot of youth work activity is under threat in terms of overall funding. Because it's not a strong statutory service, and it has a statutory basis, but it's not as strong, and so we are seeing cuts to youth work services. So there's a bit of a sense within the sector that it's adapted, it changed, it worked in this way to support young people in very specific ways around their mental health and well-being, and it wants to get back to youth work and educational opportunities through youth work. And I suppose in hindsight, a more clear essential worker or dedicated space would have been, we know you want to help with that, and that's great, but actually that's for us to consider, or you'll do this for a period of time, but you need to come back to your day job, which is youth work, and it's highly valued and respected and has a key role in terms of young people's education and skills development.
Thank you. And then if you could please just, you talk about it at paragraphs 102 to 104, just about the impact on and loss of youth workers. So if you could please just describe some of the challenges just in terms of workload change and delivery of digital training, and what impacts those had on youth workers and volunteers.
So yes, the decline, as I've mentioned there, in terms of the numbers of volunteer youth workers in particular in the voluntary sector, you had a number of, it's from 73,000 to 46,000, so that's a significant fall, and it is kind of trying to build back, but you were losing a lot of volunteers, especially as older volunteers who understandably took this opportunity to kind of step away. They may well have had more concerns and rightly around COVID and how it might impact them, so that had a significant impact on the sector today, in terms of some of our organisations have waiting lists for children and young people to come and be part of it, because we're trying to grow a workforce of volunteers, but those volunteers also need part-time staff and full-time staff as supporting that provision, and also doing direct, more targeted interventions as well. I guess the numbers challenge is a big one, and on top of that, the financial challenge, which I've mentioned. We're coming to a situation where it's post-Brexit. We have cost of living costs going up for some of our charities as well. We've got the national insurance hike as well. It's going to be impacting things, and charitable trusts as well. Their funding sources, as well as the local government and national government, is declining. So we're, as an agency, we're setting up a kind of an investment, a group looking at youth work and sustainable investment for youth work across the piece. What government's funding is for it, and also what trust funds can support. I think a telling stat was 70% in one of our surveys believed that cuts to youth work services and budgets would happen post-COVID. And that was them saying it during that COVID period, and it's now playing out, which is something that we're very keen to address, and to ensure that with the UNCRC in particular coming in, that young people have a right to youth work and to high quality youth work. And
obviously you've discussed the challenges with loss of youth workers and volunteers. What is the demand for youth work services post-pandemic looking like?
So I think the demand is growing hugely. We had a conference just last week around prevention, along with Public Health Scotland, thinking about early intervention and prevention and the opportunities to look at that in terms of the impacts on children and young people if they don't have these opportunities to develop their skills and get supported with mental health and well-being, etc. So in the kind of space of youth justice, in the space of health and well-being and educational pathways, these, I think it's so crucial that we have opportunities for children and young people to thrive and to succeed. And I think we need the full spectrum, and what youth work provides is a holistic service for children and young people that connects their interests with what their educational needs are, and so the mental health and well-being post-pandemic is getting worse for children and young people. There's a number of factors in there that we could talk about, but it's something that has increased the need for kind of these early intervention and universal opportunities and provision through schools and through youth work to prevent sort of longer term negative outcomes for children and young people.
Thank you. I'm conscious of our time. I think we've got just over 10 minutes left. I'd just like to touch on, you've got a section on the impacts on YouthLink Scotland and engagement with the Scottish Government, starting at paragraphs 53 and following. And at paragraph 70, you say that the two biggest impacts were delivering the training and developing the guidance on COVID-19 guidance, digital guidance, and detached youth work guidance, and that it was resource intensive. Could you please touch briefly on the issues in relation to, or the impacts in relation to delivering training, but then I'd like to come on to discuss some of the issues in relation to developing guidance and some of the frustrations around that, against a background that we're going to be hearing from a panel of youth workers this afternoon who will be discussing in particular challenges that they had around guidance. So if you could start briefly about the delivering of training.
So the training I've mentioned around sort of mental health and well-being and digital and all of these was very much about us collecting the best practice across the sector and delivering online training so that we were supporting youth workers around some of the issues that we've discussed already around safeguarding, around signposting and so on. So there was training around that, but in terms of the actual guidance itself, that took a lot of information sharing, a lot of sessions online where we were making ourselves available to answer questions about interpretations of the guidance and what that meant and how people could apply it and how they could apply it safely. The guidance was changing quite regularly, and one of the challenges that I've mentioned there is that in our sector in particular, we quite often had an idea that the guidance was going to change, but it wasn't till the last thing on a Friday that we finally got it kind of signed off, and we had a whole realm of people waiting to do weekend activity. So I wonder in reflection, is that because again people were thinking more about maybe the formal education thing starting again on a Monday, but we had a lot of people that were lined up and ready to do a lot of activity over the key weekend period. So that was a real challenge for us. We had people working, as it's not lots of people worked extra hours and it was resource intense during the COVID period, but so as it should have been, but I guess there was one or two things I think if that would have helped our sector better. What we managed to do was make sense of it for these different settings. So as I mentioned before, different guidance for the use of a community centre or space versus what the school's guidance was saying. Because remember, youth work is also taking place in schools or with schools at the second part of the day, and some of that guidance was overlapping, but sometimes it was contradicting as well, which was causing confusion to the sector. And I think we did a good job of trying to iron that out and explain that to some of those that were developing the policy and guidance. It wasn't an easy task to do, but likewise from our point of view it had a big impact in terms of the amount of work and resource that we as an agency put into that to ensure that people had the best information, that they were making the adaptations that they needed to make.
Mr. Frew,
sorry, could I just say, you were talking about government, so equally I'm talking just about guidance and as if it's a linear thing. There's also the cross-party group on children and young people, and we were very much wanting to get young people's voices through the youth work process. And I haven't said a lot about that. That was really important, that not just through the surveys, but actually ensuring that we had young people getting the chance to speak to those in Parliament on different cross-party groups and in organising opportunities for young people to speak directly with their lived experience into some of those myriad of different COVID groups that were planning. So our key job for us was to ensure that their voice was held in those different spaces and heard properly. Thank you.
I'm going to give you an opportunity to articulate any potential lessons to be learned or things that could be done better or not to have been done in the event of a future pandemic or other emergency. But before I do, are there any other challenges in relation to impacts on YouthLink that you'd like to highlight? We've obviously got your statement, but is there anything else you'd like to highlight before going on to identify any potential lessons learned?
I suppose the challenges for us going forward is something that is facing a number of charities and intermediary bodies in particular. So I've mentioned the importance of being kind of one agency that connects, brings a collective together of community-based organisations with national charities that are voluntary along with local government, and is a safe space for all of those conversations to be held separately but also together. So I suppose I do have concerns in terms of our own funding, which has just been cut this year, that longer term multi-year funding, which is a wider issue that the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations has brought up, and we brought up in Parliament in terms of fair funding to have these in place. And how that relates to COVID, I suppose, is that there's a real key role for intermediaries to play to communicate what a whole sector is facing to government and to work with government to overcome the challenges. So that's a key role for us, not just in this space of emergency and trying to deal with the pandemic, but in terms of the general needs of children and young people. So that's an ongoing issue. Did you want me to talk about future things that I could...
Lessons. Any potential lessons learned?
So one of the things, I suppose, would be around UK-wide guidance. So bear in mind that some of the charities that we support that have got their are UK-wide, and that was an extra level of complexity that I've not talked in terms of resource and guidance. So when some organisations were trying to communicate to 4 nations at the same time about slightly different restrictions in different places, and any kind of, once restrictions eased, there was maybe organisations coming up from England to do an activity, a residential summer activity in Scotland, and what did they need to know? So there's maybe something about that. I think it would have been helpful for ourselves to be more connected to some of the discussions that were happening in schools. So we weren't on the schools group, COVID recovery group. We were sitting in advanced learning and science, which is where colleges and universities, and the conversations were mostly about HE and colleges. We did have a voice into that place, but I think it would have been helpful for us to have had a voice also, or maybe more so, with the same age bracket of young people and with schools that we were working with. The issue of essential workers, and I've brought up kind of recognising what the sector does, and understanding it better, especially around prevention and inequality, and supporting vulnerable young people. So at various stages you've asked about different types of funding. Almost all of those aspects of funding in terms of the Summer Fund and Youth Work Education Recovery Fund were very targeted funds around children and young people that were needing that support in terms of education recovery, and especially in areas of real need and poverty in Scotland. So I think it's important to emphasise that. And I mentioned the issue of facilities, so it won't go into that again, but it's still an issue that's got a legacy with it in terms of getting back into some of the facilities that Youth Work had pre-pandemic has still not happened in some places because other people have the resource to book lets and so on for commercial use, and that's something that I think needs to be addressed. And if we can maintain, if we have another situation like this, which we hopefully won't, if we can maintain face-to-face learning for young people, if they're not a specific threat to them, then obviously that would be the preferred in terms of everything, in terms of isolation, loneliness, mental health and well-being, and education and achievement. If we can maintain face-to-face where possible along with schools, that's what we would seek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frew. My Lord, I don't have any more questions unless your Lordship has any.
No, I'm fine, thank you very much indeed. Yes, thank you, Mr. Frew, thank you, Ms. Van der Westhuizen. Right, it's 11:28, so we'll come back for the next witness at 11:45. Thank you.
Thank you, my Lord.
Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Miss Stewart. Now, you have another witness for us, I believe.
I do, thank you. Giving evidence this morning, my lord, is Neil Young of St Paul's Youth Forum.
Very good. Good morning, Mr. Young.
Good morning.
Miss Stewart will have some questions for you, and we'll
Thank
start
you.
now.
Thank you.
Thank
Can
you
you
very much.
please give us your full name?
My name's Neil James Young.
And you have given a statement to the inquiry.
Yes, I have.
And for the transcript, that's reference WT0448. And Mr Young, you are a youth leader at St Paul's Youth Forum. How long have you held that role for?
I've been in this organisation for 23 years in the One community.
And how long have you held the particular role of youth leader?
I've been the person in charge of the organisation for all of that length of time. When I first came in, there was 4 young people on a Thursday night that we had to work with, and now we're working with over 750 people a week from our facility.
Thank you. And can you tell us a bit about St Paul's Youth Forum in terms of its aims and objectives?
The organisation was formed from some voluntary groups way back in '97, and its aims have continued to be the same of looking to alleviate the worst effects of poverty. We are based in a community that's in the bottom 2% of SIMDs, and so we're looking really to help make people's lives a little bit easier and a little bit better.
And in terms of your particular role there as youth leader over the years, what does that role involve, and in particular, what did it involve in the pandemic response period?
So I'm currently responsible for 26 members of staff, a team during COVID, which was more about 15, 16, and a lot of what my role is about ensuring that the staff are working safely and effectively, and really kind of guiding the organisation and the staff team and volunteers through the objectives of the board. And so we cover a huge amount of different work, and so whether it be from traditional youth work and running activities for children and young people, through to also work around food insecurity, recognising that if young people didn't have something to eat, they were less able to concentrate, and so there's a large area of that grew into an urban farm. And we also have a large project that's dealing with cycling and getting people both active and able to move around the community.
Thank you. And your statement tells us that the forum is based in Provan Mill in Glasgow. Can you tell us a bit more about the demographic of that area?
So it is a community that was formed in the 1930s as part of an overspill from what was the Garangad slums, Royston. It's one that is a very mixed community, but a very young community in our area. The average life expectancy is way below the national average, around 68 for males. And we have a much less healthy community with lots of people. It's said that the healthy age is 44, where people then start to require additional help from medical professionals. And so it's one where you're more likely to suffer a heart attack, you're more likely to have respiratory disease, and that is primarily due to poverty. As I said, it's in the bottom 1% actually for health, and the bottom 2% for both educational attainment and education and employment. And so there's a number of different areas that we've been able to analyse and then work towards addressing in some way some of those different challenges.
Thank you. I want to ask you today about youth work pre-pandemic and during the pandemic and the impacts that you've articulated in your witness statement. But first of all, in terms of youth work and what it is, and in particular how it relates to education, can you explain a bit about that for us?
The biggest bit that we hold on to with youth work is that young people choose to participate. It is not a requirement of anybody to go and attend. And so that is, so people who come along to be involved with us come of their own free will and volition. Where it partners with education is that youth work is part of partners in the learning journey. And that learning journey is much broader than just numeracy and literacy, but incorporating as many different things. And so for some youth work organisations, it will be around going camping and learning outdoor skills. For others, it will be learning how to ride a bike. So we have lots of different ways that young people come into learning. One of the things that we've been operating since 2001 has been our youth-led radio station, and there young people have been learning not only the skills of broadcasting and using radio equipment, but we quite often have used it as a stealth education, with young people looking to write down what they're going to say. Oh, I'm not that good at writing, mister. Okay, come on, we'll help you. I'm going to add up all your different numbers to make sure we can see how long your music's going to last. Oh, I'm not that good at adding, mister. And so they think that they're coming to become DJs, but actually they're working on core literacy and numeracy in different ways. And so we've partnered with both local secondary schools and primary schools for many years, bringing a different way and a different methodology of people being able to learn, and through to gaining qualifications. And so we created an SQA qualification around our radio station, which gives people that first accredited pathway within the SQA. And so it's one where education is at the core of what we do, but it's in a very different style and methodology to what formal education would be.
Okay, I'm going to come on to ask you about your collaboration with schools in a moment, but can you give us a flavour of what youth work at St Paul's Youth Forum looked like pre-pandemic in terms of the offering? You've mentioned camping and bike riding.
Yep. There's many things that would be seen similar around the country. Our young people are part of the core leadership of the organisation. We have young people on our management board, and they've helped to direct some of the issues that we've needed. When we discovered that there was a lot of youth crime and violence in our community, we asked the young people why, and they said, well, we're bored. And so being able to put on alternatives for them to do. So on a Wednesday through to Saturday night, every evening there will be different activities for young people to do. And so whether that's through traditional things like dance and sport, through playing games, through being able to have a safe and secure place where they know that they can come without any worries, where there are interested, good adults that are able to work with them alongside their different issues that they are facing. It's a space where young people would come and learn cooking. They would come and take part with our wood-fired pizza oven. They would do some gardening. They would play with our chickens. All these kind of different bits and pieces are just different opportunities that young people have offered and wanted. And so we would help facilitate that. And again, coming back to that kind of partners on the learning journey, we would work with them on, I've got this idea, okay, well, let's see how we can make that happen. And so from as simple as I want to play a football game against somebody else, let's get a team together, how do we do that? And these young people are able to work together with our trained staff to be able to make these kind of things happen, through to some more obscure and young people going off on international trips to Iceland and to Zambia as part of their work, looking to collaborate with other young people around the globe. So there was a whole huge amount of different work taking place where young people were learning. We would also be working in schools, and that was, I think, a key to what was happening, is that we were very welcome within both the primary and secondary schools, and so had a strong relationship and bond with senior management, pastoral care staff, and so we were a known entity with that, and so they trusted us in terms of the kind of content that we were providing and recognising the unique skills that the team had.
Thank you. In terms of delivery of youth work, during the pandemic we have the statement of Mark Smith, who is a youth worker at St Paul's Youth Forum, in which he describes how such activities were delivered online, and this statement can be found at reference WT0251. I'm not going to ask you too much about that, given we have this evidence in his statement, but I want to ask you to build on what you say about friendships at paragraph 44. And I wonder if you can describe for us in general terms the importance of friendships, in particular for young people, and what it was about the online delivery of youth work that impacted those friendships and the formation of them.
I think that at the core of humanity is wanting to be able to relate to others. we're pack animals. We want to be involved, and whether that's through a family unit, but particularly in your teenage years where you are looking to develop your own identity, it's vital that young people are able to meet with other young people. Now, for many young people, that is what happens at school, and playtime and break can actually be quite a challenging time as they try and work through that social awkwardness. But for most young people, being able to hang out with friends is seen as an important part of developing and growing, shaping who they are. And so it's one where we are very used to seeing people in person, but as we moved online from 2006 onwards, there was more and more things would happen online. Young people being able to have mobile phones and being able to interact online, it became an area where people could nefariously exploit that. And so we were worried, young people have been taught how to protect themselves online and online safety. And so the easiest way to know who you're speaking to is to see them in person. Is it going to be some 40-year-old person stuck away in a phone pretending to be somebody that's 13? And so the easiest way to do that is to come in person. So there's been a number of different bits and pieces. Our team recognised that particularly a number of the boys would be playing consoles online. And so that was an area pre-pandemic that we were able to build rapport and build some of these relationships. And so it was something that we were able to see happening beforehand. And there was therefore a structure and a procedure that we had set out about how we could safely participate with young people online and create that. So there was already a framework to operate.
Okay. I want to ask you now about the collaboration with schools. You've touched on the collaboration, the partnership on the learning journey and the SQA qualification. Can you explain a bit more about the nature of the relationship St Paul's Youth Forum has with the local schools and what you sought to achieve through that?
I guess there's a number of different layers to the work that we do with our schools. And if I take our secondary school as a kind of a good example, in our secondary school, there is a large communal area where people meet for lunch, and we call it the street in many Glasgow schools. And in that area, we were able to do almost detached youth work, which is being able to just stand about, and young people would come and have conversations with us, and it would build up some of that relationship. So it was another trusted adult that people knew was somebody that they could turn to and talk to about things, but also share their life with. We would work with school with the personal, social and health education and deliver classes on a number of different topics. Again, just adding a different flavour to the teaching staff, bringing in some of the knowledge that we have from out in the community and helping to build that community link with the school. And so from that, young people could come and volunteer and develop skills with our project, but we'd also help them to find other volunteering positions that may not just necessarily be with us. We would do formal assemblies with schools, and they're able to have different topics that the schools are looking to support. And we'd be able to work alongside academic staff in terms of supporting mental health and young people who just need a little bit more nurture. And so to be part of that team, I don't think you could meet a school in Scotland that would say that they've got a plethora of staff and that actually everything's great. They would love to have always more influence, more good adults that are able to make that impact in the young people's lives. And so there was a huge amount of different work that we've carried out over the years with the schools. In primary schools, similarly, we would have that. And again, I'm thinking to us working with some of the enhanced nurture departments within our local primary school, and also being able to take them to our growing spaces, and so young people hatching eggs in their class and then seeing these hens grow up and then 18 weeks later learning to cook with the same eggs that have come from the chickens that they hatched. And so that real connection to farm and fork for an urban community has also been very important.
Thank you. You mentioned at paragraph 9 in respect of the transition to online learning that schools did not know how to transition to online learning, and how to connect with students, and that St Paul's Youth Forum worked alongside them to achieve this. Can you describe as you see it the difficulties that the schools faced with this?
Naturally, there was an awful lot of worry about keeping young people safe. And so the guidelines that were coming through from education take an awful lot longer to be able to do that. As a small organisation, we're able to take quite quick advice and be able to make that work an awful lot easier. And so we selected, for example, to use Zoom, where schools were trying to make teams work. And Zoom was chosen by us due to its simplicity and the fact that we'd used it previously, whereas other folks weren't. But we were also able to use the consoles. We'd already been working with young people and talking to them through PlayStations, playing FIFA and things like that. And so there was already a way of connecting in with a group of young people easily. So we were quite quickly able to do, within the first week, check-ins, first of all, making sure that their mental health was okay and was there any requirements. Part of our organisation was tackling food insecurity, so making sure that that was all there. And then being able to start to work with some of the young people who didn't have accessible devices, and how do you install Teams on my phone? I don't know how to do that. And so being able to support them through different methods that we already had. So we were able to be just that little bit more rapid and that little bit more specific. And with our relationship that we had with young people outside of school, we were able to be that trusted adult of, yeah, these guys know how to fix this, we'll ask them.
I want to ask you now about the expansion of the forum during the pandemic, and you set out in your statements at paragraph 12 and following that the pandemic was one of the factors that allowed your organisation to grow from a small to a medium-sized charity, and you attribute this growth to two things. First of all, your place-based approach. Can you tell us a bit about what you mean by this?
I guess, place-based approach is something that both the Scottish Government and academics look at. For us, what was really vital was that we were a respected organisation before the pandemic in a small community. And so we were able to pull in a number of different resources quite quickly and easily because that infrastructure was already in place. 70% of our staff team live within our community, and so they are local people who know the local situation well. And so that enabled us to be able to target support to those that were needing it most quickly. That place-based approach meant that we know this is the street, this is the person, these are the different assets that we have around, and so being able to respond to that. And so we had local government, we had national charities, being able to phone up and say, what resources do you need, because we know that we've a relationship with you, that you're within that community and can make an impact within that community quickly. And so that enabled us to respond very rapidly to what was needed and required at the very beginning.
Thank you. I want to turn to ask you now about some of the impacts you've expressed in your witness statement. First of all, in relation to mental health, both in respect of the workforce and the young people that you work with. First of all, in relation to the workforce, you set out at paragraph 16 and following that you quickly found many of the staff were missing in-person connections given the nature of your work. Can you tell us a bit more about their role during the pandemic and what impact it had on them in terms of their mental health?
I think, for example, one of my staff members who lives locally, he is face-to-face with young people 28 hours in a week. Being able to take all the different cues that come from that conversations and really being able to drill down into where young people are at with that and provide the support that's required. He suddenly was almost disabled from so many different cues. Many young people didn't want to have cameras on, so you're not able to see the facial responses. Some young people didn't even have that opportunity to put a camera on because their broadband wasn't fast enough. And so he, in particular, as an example, was somebody that was really struggling to find his way with that. And we were very fortunate that when his mental health started to take a severe turn for the worse, we were able to put him into some of our food delivery so that he could have that in-person connection, and therefore that gave some of that energy to be able to work with our online activities that were going on. We were doing maybe 5 hours of online activity a day midweek, and so that was a severe drain on people's energy and ability to do stuff, particularly when there wasn't the cues coming back from young people. And so a lot of the staff team were really struggling to adapt to a different way of working when that is so much of their bread and butter.
And you say, I think we'll be facing years of mental health impacts as people continue to unpack what was going on during the pandemic. In terms of the ongoing impacts on the mental health of the workforce, is that something you're continuing to see?
Unfortunately, last summer we lost, as I mentioned in my statement, a very good member of staff from our team whose mental health rapidly went down after the pandemic. He had been able to keep everything going, was a manager of the youth team, but it was one where he felt that there was just too much pressure. And I think there is a large amount of unpacking that we've had to do and continue to do with the staff team, who feel that were they able to offer enough? Could their support have been better? And I think because of some of the traumas that were being faced on a day-to-day basis by our young people, providing a way to support that was a real challenge. And so it's one where, I think that there are a number of members of the staff team who still to this day would attribute some of their trauma and mental health challenges due to that time and feeling the pressure that they had to perform their job at a higher level and come up with a whole lot more to be able to support the young people that they work with and care for.
Thank you. In terms of the impacts on the young people, you've ordered these under various headings, for example, nocturnal behaviour, addiction, and so on. I want to ask, first of all, you start this section at paragraph 22 about young people essentially becoming nocturnal in their behaviour. How was it that you became aware of this pattern?
I think that when we were switching on our evenings activities, it's 6:30, 7 o'clock, we're seeing young people with a bowl of cornflakes. Now, that's not an unusual thing to see, but we're like, is that your dinner? No, this is my breakfast, I'm just up. And we started to delve into that as it happened more and more. And so young people would be getting up 5, 6 p.m. and then having their day through till 7 or 8 in the morning and then sleeping during the day. And so we spent a lot of time trying to work out with them what it was about. Now, for some of them, it was the only quiet time in their house when everybody had gone to bed. A number of our young people, their family members were key workers. And so that conversation of time to get up, it's time for school. Oh, I'm really tired. Well, I need to get out of the house. And then the young people would just go back to sleep and back to bed. And other people who were it was their way of coping and getting some kind of control within their lives. This is something I can do. I can decide for myself when I get up and when I go to bed. And so therefore, I feel as if there's something that I can do that's making an impact with my life. And
how was the forum able to respond to that in terms of your service delivery?
I think that naturally, because school's a 9 till 3 activity, and teaching staff are that's where they're available. Young people would be able to come on and say, well, maybe I've got some homework to do. and we'll maybe talk through that. One of my favourite activities that they did, which I was completely shocked about, what the young people wanted to do, was we had a story time. So we distributed novels to people, and they all took turns to read a chapter to each other. And this is 14, 15-year-old boys who are used to going out and playing football and being quite what they would call macho, and actually they're sitting reading to each other. And those kind of bits and pieces really enhancing what their education, and all our education professionals saying the best thing they can do is to read. Suddenly finding that. And that reading group also turned up with people. A mother once came on and said, "Is it all right if I switch this off because my kid's fallen asleep?" And it was the first time the kid had fallen asleep at a normal time. And so there's a number of different bits and pieces. And because we naturally do youth work in the evenings, we're able to then work through with the nocturnal young people. And so when they'd normally be going to school in the morning, they were coming to youth club in their morning instead, long after the teaching staff had officially signed off. And
I wanted to ask you about that in particular. Presumably they weren't able to attend their certainly the live online sessions because of their sleep pattern.
Yeah, and so it's one of these ones. Again, if you have parents working from home, then that's fine, but they're able to kind of cajole their young people into, come on, 10 o'clock, school's there, you should be up at 10 a.m. These young people, quite often, their parents were key workers, so we're out doing stuff, whether that's working in the hospitals or working in other key areas. And so they would be left more to their own devices. And other parents that we know of are like, if you don't want to get up, that's your problem. I've got my own worries to deal with. I'm going to just leave you to that, and we can sort it out. And again, one of the things that was great with our collaboration with education was that we were able to inform teaching staff of what was going on, and so they would be less worried about what that young person was doing. Oh, you're spending some time with them, that's great. If you can get them to do this or to do that, that would be helpful, but it's not vital. And I think that particularly during the first lockdown, there was an awful lot of emphasis on ensuring that young people's mental health was looked after, and how are we making sure that there's still those connections and that young people are okay. And so we had a way in of daily conversations with a number of young people.
You spoke there about the collaboration with schools again. You mentioned at paragraph 25 that there was a choice to focus on the senior pupils. Did they start to attend online schooling lessons, or did they do their schooling through St Paul's Youth Forum?
Again, there was a big variety. We had some senior pupils who, again, didn't want to work in that traditional 9 till 3 with the online schooling. So that's when we were able to work with them and keep them going. During the summer programmes, we always hold a holiday club, and we know that when young people are attending our holiday club, they don't lose as much of the academic time, and so the teachers notice the ones that have been with us and who haven't. And that was similar for the ones that weren't attending. They were still keeping up a number of those core numeracy, literacy skills. And from different things like being able to do online quizzes and things like that, young people were still keeping their brains focused on some of their academic work. And they would do a chemistry quiz for folks to be able to do that. And so that kept them kind of doing a little bit of the work. And so we also knew through the collaboration with the secondary school that there was going to be the planning was that the senior pupils were the ones that the school was going to really spend a lot more time on. And so for the junior school, being able to support them going, the teaching staff can't manage everything, come and be involved with us, and we're able to make sure that you're keeping ticking over.
And in terms of that work, that what you refer to as catch-up with the lower schools and the primary schools, is that still part of the work that St Paul's Youth Forum is involved in?
I think that, yes, we're still involved, and I think that there is a huge amount of research that still needs to be done more nationally. We work with a number of young people who are really disengaged from school and no longer seeing mainstream school as something they need to be part of. And so we're finding different ways of supporting young people, and it can be as simple as them just getting to school in the mornings, just that little bit too difficult, but alongside being able to support young people within the school. And so we see across the board. Resilience is very, very low for a number of our, particularly SIMD 1 and 2 young people. They find difficulty concentrating, they find difficulty sitting still, and so being put back into a mainstream classroom is a major struggle for a number of them. And I would say that we are dealing now more with young people who are struggling with mainstream school and being able to do that. And it's come at a similar time when there's been fewer resources within education to be able to tackle that, as budgets have been constrained. And so because of that collaboration, because of the fact that we're all looking to support young people, we're able to step in and provide some of that support.
I'm going to come on in a short while to ask you about some of these ongoing impacts. You've mentioned their attainment and attendance, but before I do so, I want to ask you about digital inclusion. And you set out at paragraph 36 and 37 that there was an issue with a lack of devices and a lack of connectivity. Can you expand for us on what the issues were and which cohorts, if any, that had a particular impact on?
It's one where there was a really massive digital divide. There were some families who had devices that were able to be worked on, but we some of the stories were there was a family that had 5 kids in the school who were all gathered around one phone, and so trying to teach 5 different levels, and so that became impossible. And so we were able to get hold of devices and funding to secure that. Other families who maybe had 2 devices that were able to be to work for their 2 kids, but the kids were online doing other things as well, so their broadband quite quickly reduced down, and so they didn't have the resources to be able to keep going. And so the first couple of weeks were great, but the next couple of weeks and that month there was no connection. And so again, being able to source some of the digital connections. This was something that was really good coming from, we worked in collaboration with the Housing Association and with funders to be able to bring those resources into our community. And so there was ways that particularly schools weren't able to get the same resources, and so the head teacher from the primary school, for example, would go, I think there's these families, is there any chance that you can support these? And so of course we were able to make that happen and dropping off 50, 60 tablets to the school to be able to say, okay, these are ones that are coming from us. And again, that procurement process, the schools may have been able to deliver that, but because of the procurement process, we could go on Amazon and other retailers and have it with us the next day. And so we were able to very quickly put that into people's hands and connect people in. And so being that smaller organisation really benefited within those kind of structures.
Thank you. And you mentioned at paragraph 46 that in terms of digital equality, there was a disproportionate impact on those from ethnic minority communities.
Certainly that was our experience, was that a number of ethnic minority families who we'd had a relationship both through with our holiday food programme and our food insecurity programme, a number of them where English isn't their first language maybe didn't understand what was coming out, and so didn't get the resources that could have been due to them. And so when we were speaking to them around our food delivery, we were able then to be able to add more devices to that household. And it tended to be those who English wasn't their first language in a lot of BME families.
Thank you. I want to turn now to looking at your heading addiction, which starts at paragraph 38, and you highlight that this was an issue during the pandemic and that there was an increase in the number of young people who started taking drugs at that time.
I think that where there is a void, there is always something that comes into that void and into that vacuum. And a number of the dealers within our community, and we come from a community where most kind of 8 to 10-year-olds can tell you where to buy drugs in the different houses. It's very well known. And so they were able to go, okay, you're a bit bored, you're a bit stressed, here, have some cannabis, and been able to relax. actually you want something a bit more exciting because it's the weekend. And so suddenly young people being involved with that, because there wasn't this traditional structures that were in place, they found their ways into that. And that became much more prevalent, and then young people being able to go, well, I don't have the money. Well, if you go and take this package to my friend, I'll give you your next bit. And so when it came after the pandemic and trying to get young people into employment, a number of the young people said, well, give me 50 quid an hour, because that's what I'm getting at the moment from my friend. And that risk v reward was one where, why should I do something that's legal when I'm going to be paid an awful lot less for doing something that will be harder work? And so there is a lack of the criminal justice system catching up with some of these. Now, I'm pleased to say that the criminal justice system is working its way through a number of those situations, but there is still a much larger a group of a cohort. They're now kind of in their very early 20s who have gone from being that kind of late teens and sucked into that area that have come through, and so we're now facing addiction issues as alongside the employment issues with that, and so it's one of those ones where if they'd broken their leg during the pandemic, we would have been able to fix that there and then. That would have been seen as important, whereas some of their mental health wasn't able to be fixed immediately, and so therefore they found ways of fixing it themselves, and that's unfortunately led into addictions.
Thank you. In terms of alcohol abuse, you say young people used to drink in the park pre-pandemic, but that this isn't so much of a problem anymore. Do you have any insight into why that's the case?
I think that when people were kind of banned from the parks, it wasn't kind of almost kind of chaining up the swings. That people stopped doing that, and so found different things to do. And it's one where young people have now gone and found other activities to do that. And so for us, we've got many young people who are coming along to our clubs on a Friday and Saturday night instead of going out drinking, and some who it will be very small groups in the house with parents, and parents much more in support and control of that situation, so a much more safe space for young people to be experimenting with alcohol. So I think there has been a bit of a change, and seeing that and recognising that when so much of the community started using alcohol more during the pandemic, that similarly that fell off after the pandemic, and people not being able to both afford it and see that there's different and better things to do. And so our young people, it's just not something that's part of their weekend lexicon that used to be. And so it's we're delighted that there's so many that will engage in services rather than be involved in a park.
Is there a link to be made between the decline in alcohol abuse and the increase in the use of other substances? Certainly
there is a number of folks that as one went down, another went up, the substances went up, but I would say that seems to be a generational shift that has moved on, and the new generation coming in behind that have been less involved.
I want to turn now to look at ongoing impacts, and you've alluded to some of these already in terms of concentration and engagement and motivation. Your section on this is at paragraph 51 and following. You highlight here the ability of young people to concentrate has been affected. Can you elaborate on that for us?
We before the pandemic, we were in schools and would be working with pupils in class, and now we're doing an awful lot working alongside the schools with young people who are struggling, and so there is far more young people who are looking for those services. Young people are much less able to sit down in a class for a long time, a period of time, and general concentration, whether that be both within the youth club setting or within the school setting. It's one where people want to wander about a bit more. People have got out of the way being able to concentrate. I think that there is a huge issue around mobile phones and that response of doom scrolling and where that is there. And young people are now looking for a much more kind of that quick dopamine hit of, is this the funny cat that's going to be appearing on my screen? And so when it's in classroom or whether it's out of the classroom, they're wanting more than just what was the same stuff that was happening before. And so that makes it much harder for those who are able to sit and learn within a classroom setting alongside these young people who need that a little bit more. And so alongside our partners in formal education, we're able to then either work with some of these young people and move them into small groups. And so our radio station still will go in and take groups of 6 or 7 young people away rather than dealing with a whole class approach. And so that means that the teaching staff are able to work with that, while the main group, and we're able to then take those young people that would be distracting other folks away, so enabling that learning to take place within the school. But there is certainly a much greater need for support with our young people, and I would say an awful lot more research behind it, because it's our thoughts as a team that it's around that mobile phone use, but there may be far more that it's around in terms of their resilience and ability to concentrate.
At that same paragraph, you mention there has also been an impact on their ability to interact with their contemporaries and with adults. How does that manifest itself?
There are times when you can see, and it's one. I think that it's maybe not just young people, but if you'll see people just sitting together, scrolling. They're not talking to each other, but they're all just zombied out, doom scrolling, and so it takes an awful lot more interaction to get these young people involved in stuff. Now, I've been able to be involved with young people where we've taken the phones off them, and it's almost as if they've been released from a spell. And young people doing fantastic interaction cross-generationally around that. And it's one where I think that there is some indications of how to make this situation better. But there's also that area with our young people, when we asked them, we did a survey with them around mobile phone use, and how they said, well, we need to keep our phones with us. We don't know what's going to happen to my mum, to my granny, whatever's going on. And so there is that constant fear that these young people are living in, that heightened anxiety that something bad is going to happen next. And it doesn't help that we've got situations in Ukraine, in Gaza, Russia, America, all adding to these young people's knowledge of where the world is at the moment, and they're very fearful. And I think there is something that we can relate to the fact that Public Health Scotland are saying that young people are now, only 1 in 5 young people are very happy, as opposed to 50% a few years ago. There is something massive that is going on that I think we need to address with our young people, and I think that mobile phones plays a significant role within that.
You've touched there on mental health and anxiety perhaps being a root cause of that. Could it be said it's a speech and communication issue as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the young people, I don't know if they're fearful to lose some of the relationships they've had, and so therefore it's better not to speak than to upset somebody. They've missed out on some of that learning at a crucial stage about how you make friends and influence people, how you form those social groupings. And so yes, we have got young people who are much more in the background and would talk. We're speaking to 12-year-olds who are saying, "Oh, my social battery is reduced, and so therefore I don't want to speak to people today." And so they're much more used to being on their own, sitting in their own rooms, doing that and segregating themselves off. And we see that within schools, and we're very fortunate that they feel comfortable enough in our project to come in and just sit. And we're able to start to work on that group work stuff. But I think there is a fear around that rejection. And so therefore, if I'm not doing anything that's going to highlight my differences, then I'm not going to be rejected, and so I'll do the same as others.
And you say this is something that affects those from lower SIMD areas the most.
I would say that within our families that we're working with, the lower SIMD families, I think that there is something around the whole family struggling much more around where is the food going to come from, where is the work going to come from, and being much more fearful of the future. They don't have the savings, the ability to have that kind of rainy day fund. And so the families themselves are dealing with a whole lot of challenges, and so therefore they don't have that ability to support their young people. And so that interaction of kind of how's your day, what you doing, they're more interested in their own way and their own mental health rather than trying to support their young person alongside that. And so there is, definitely some struggles there that I would say fit the brackets that are around those lower SIMD brackets.
And in terms of the concentration and the inability to sit still or to interact with others, to what extent is that attributable to the pandemic experience?
I think it's certainly far more noticeable, and so in terms of the youth groups that we've had, young people would have been able to sit down for an hour session. Now, if they can do 20 minutes, that's a great session. And so there is certainly something that has happened since then where young people are more used to doing their own thing. For us, we've countered that by having more young people lead, and so since the pandemic we've got a far greater peer education group, and so we have a dozen young people who are trained now within our youth project, and we've trained up another 30-40 young people within the school to be peer educators, and young people will listen more to young people now. I don't know if that is because their trusted adults didn't stand up for them quite as much because they were dealing with things themselves, the adults were dealing with things themselves, or that young people have created that bubble because of their nocturnal stuff and therefore reliant more on their social bubbles that were around rather than their familial bubbles. But there is certainly something around that change that happened post-pandemic for these young people.
Do you think there's anything in connection with the form of education delivery during the pandemic that's impacted them?
I think for some of our young people, they saw that it was a massive break from school, that school wasn't as important to them anymore, and that the crucial thing that the government was saying was to stay safe and stay at home. And I think that there is a number of folks who would have benefited more from recognising that they could have been in a mainstream education facility. Again, that's decisions that were made, but it's one where I think that young people definitely have faced more challenges because they had that big block of time off, then the summer holidays, and so virtually almost 6 months of no formal education for them that then has had a significant impact. And then to go back and have the schools closed again, albeit much better resourced for the second lockdown, still is education that important, particularly for the young people who maybe, your dad didn't go to school, he left school at 14 and got a job, you're going to do the same, so you don't need to worry about qualifications. And recognising that both schools and youth projects provide so much more than just your literacy and numeracy and your different qualifications, but there's so much around the social aspect of development that's there as well. And so, if it's not important to the government, then is it important to me now?
Thank you, and you've touched on it already, but I want to ask you about attendance and attainment. First of all, in relation to attendance, which you speak about at paragraph 54, and in particular the pandemic experience impacting attendance, and you've alluded to it already, saying that they didn't go to school, certainly not the physical school, during the pandemic, and that has perhaps impacted how they view attendance now.
Yeah, we're working with a number of young people to support, to try and get them to the basic bit of attending school. As youth workers, we know that the best place for them, for their education, is to be within the formal education system. There's so many more resources that can support them. But for so many of our young people, it is a struggle to be able to get in to the space. Now, some of that is related, for example, one of the ones I was dealing with today, this morning, was around a bullying incident that happened, and so therefore they don't have any resilience to be able to deal with that, so it's easier just not to go to school. And looking at that kind of breakdown because they've not got that same social bonds that were missed for that crucial time. And so we have a number of young people, I would say, who were in the kind of P5, 6, 7, who have really struggled to then attend school later on. And what is the point? Whereas folks who were maybe perhaps more used to secondary school were able to do that. And so there is a large number of young people who are not attending school as much as they perhaps would have done pre-pandemic. And so supporting that. Now, some of that is to do with the parents' ability to support the young person. And again, the parents trying to concentrate on them keeping the show on the road themselves. And so their window of tolerance is diminished so much that actually, if you don't want to go to the school, that's the school's problem, it's not my problem. And they can work it through. And so how to support then the families with that to enable young people to come back. And a number of young people who have had major traumatic experiences who need that much greater support with their mental health and for counselling, that then will unlock them being able to attend school again. And so there's a whole host of different areas that the numbers are quite large of those who are not attending, and we're working very hard alongside our colleagues in formal education to try and drill down to each individual one. And again, because we've got a different methodology, a different time frame of being able to do that, we can speak to the families in the evenings when they're maybe back from work or are around and are able to do that. We can work outside of that traditional 9 to 5, so we're able to partner with them to ensure that the young people can come back to school, but there is a large amount of young people who are really struggling to attend.
Thank you. And in connection with attainment, is that something you're aware of from your work with schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we know that young people are really struggling to have caught up with where they're at. We are now seeing classes that we are in with our primary school work where you could be in a primary 6 class with people who are working at the level they're supposed to be doing alongside pupils who are 2 or 3 years below where they're at. And so there's a large, and it's increasing, of young people who have not got that core literacy and numeracy skills that we're able to support as youth work professionals, but been able to see that is not decreasing as it was, and we could have seen that, and I'm thinking through to our radio project with that, where it was improving, and now young people really struggling to even just write down a few paragraphs, whereas everybody would have been able to do that. So there is certainly a large increase.
In connection with attainment, you mentioned there at paragraph 53 that you're working with secondary schools to create alternative curriculums. Can you describe for us what the school experience of somebody on an alternative curriculum would look like?
I think that we've always tried to work towards the world of work and recognising that an academic career isn't for every young person. And so we've been able to partner with the school to go, okay, if this young person is really struggling with some of the more academic subjects, we've got different opportunities for learning to continue. And so through, whether it be our farm, our cafe or our bike project, much more practical, hands-on projects for them to be involved with. And so young people are coming in and getting their elementary food hygiene and being able to serve folks in a cafe, knowing that that might be their career path to be chosen. And similarly, bike mechanics and learning some of those basic skills. And so young people are being given an alternative curriculum that enables them to be able to choose things that they can maybe see has more relevance in their immediate life. And again, I'm wondering from the kind of the conversations we're having, what's going to happen next year? What's going to happen 2 years' time, 3 years' time? Is there going to be something catastrophic that happens again in our lifetime? And so young people less willing to put in the effort for something that's going to happen in many years' time, and just going, I'm going to take what I can get right now. And so therefore, coming and working in a cafe is great because I know that I'll be able to get a job when I leave school with that. And yep. There's more people cycling, so I need to learn how to fix that, and then I can get a job that way. And so there's different ways that people are able to do that. And we have a small urban farm, and our chickens are the best mental health ambassadors that we can find. And so spending 5 minutes cuddling a chicken can really transform a number of our young people that are really struggling with interacting with humans. And so it can just make a bit of a difference. So again, that we're very fortunate to have had that funding that enables these things to happen. And for some of our projects, they're very much secondary outcomes that we weren't originally funded to do, but is making an impact within the young people's lives, and is supporting the school, because when these young people are in school, they tend to be disruptive. And so if they're not being disruptive, suddenly they're no longer the bad kid, but actually they're the kid that goes and sorts your bike, and they're the kid that goes and gets you that cake that they've made. And so there's a lot of things that they can then have pride in what they've done themselves.
Just very briefly, in terms of the impacts you've described for us today and in your statement, were these relayed to the Scottish Government at the time of their decision making about the pandemic?
We're very fortunate that there is a number of different methods that we've been able to connect in with the Scottish Government. We got a number of different funds from the Scottish Government, and so in our monitoring and evaluation of those funds, that was mentioned. And similarly, as a member of YouthLink Scotland and Youth Scotland, we give them some of our impact reports and what's going on. So it was great to have that kind of two-way conversation. We're also very lucky that our MSP is incredibly supportive of our project and visits regularly. So he was able to see firsthand the impacts and be able to take that further back to the Scottish Government.
Thank you. And just in closing, I want to ask you if there are any key lessons St Paul's Youth Forum considers should be applied to ensure these impacts you've spoken about are addressed and mitigated?
I think that one of the things that we were able to do very quickly was because of the different guidance that was coming. When we were able to get young people together in person, that was a really important thing. Young people need to spend time together, and being able to do that at a safe distance enabled a number of bits and pieces to happen. I think there is some really big research to be done about how young people interact online. What is it safe? How is that happening? And so there's some stuff around mobile phones that need to be looked at that I know that's already being part of that, but there is something about ensuring that young people can find safe ways to interact when these kind of happen. And of course that digital divide, people who are able to sit down, have a screen to themselves and supportive adults around to be able to help them learn is fantastic, but when there is not that supportive environment around, to be able to find where that is. And so it's our opinion that being able to extend those who were able to attend school in person from just key workers, families, and actually young people, that widening the number of young people at risk that would have benefited from that. But being able to then recognise that youth work can fill a huge amount of those gaps. And we were very fortunate that we were able to bend a number of different funds to make that work. We don't have we have very little funding that's particular towards some of the areas that we're able to tackle. And yeah, let's get some more young people speaking to counsellors. The trauma that's gone on for a number of those guys, their resilience is at an all-time low, and so we need to spend time building that back up again.
Thank you very much, Mr Young. I don't have any further questions for you unless you have anything to add, Lord Brailsford.
I've actually got a question for once, which is a little unusual. I'm not entirely sure how relevant it is, but first of all, thank you, Mr Young, for your most illuminating and instructive evidence. But you mentioned that one thing which you thought was very positive and was surprising to you was groups of, I think, 14, 15, 16-year-old boys who were participating in reading novels or reading novels to each other. I'm intrigued, what sort of novels were they reading?
It was one where, again, I wish I could tell you the book and the author, but what we did was we spoke with the English department at the school and said, what would you recommend? And so they had a number of different ones. And I think it was The Hunger Games was one of the ones that the boys enjoyed. But it's one where being able to get the young people also to do a bit of research was another bit for that. And so they went and had to go and read book reviews to discover what it was. But it's one where, the teaching staff were saying if you can get them to do one thing, get them to read. Because that will give them the keys to an awful lot of other things in the future. And we were shocked that it actually worked, that the young people enjoyed that. And it's one where we still, when we take young people in residentials, we will read them a bedtime story. 16, 17-year-olds that we had away in the October holidays loved it. It was their favourite part of the day to go and listen. Quite often it was to much more junior fiction than adult fiction, but it was one that it was very comforting.
Yeah, good advice, I think. Thank you very much again, Mr. Young. And that brings us to an end of this session, and we'll come back at 2 o'clock. Thank you.